10. Mutations are essential to evolution theory, but mutations can only eliminate traits. They cannot produce new features.
So, genetic entropy. Is it real? Not according to Rennie. He says,
on the contrary, biology has catalogued many traits produced by point mutations, changes at precise positions in an organism's DNA, bacterial resistance to antibiotics for example.
Yes, but has functional complexity been gained or lost in such cases? As the notorious creationist Kent Hovind has enjoyed pointing out in many of his outrageous lectures, if both your feet get chopped off, you won't get tenure anymore, at least not on your feet. And so one could make the ridiculous argument that there is a benefit there, but obviously, the costs far outweigh any benefits. There are diminishing returns here, to say the least. The same is true with beneficial mutations. This is yet another form of entropy increasing. As many serious biologists like P.H. and others are now pointing out, these examples of mutations and all other examples, such as resistance to antibiotics, have only ever been shown to be caused by genetic information loss, and molecular loss, or molecular disorganization, which gives the organism antibiotic resistance, and in such cases, there are copying errors. No new characteristics have ever been observed to be caused by increased and new specified genetic information from mutation. Only variation or downhill processes have actually been observed at the molecular level as being the cause of such characteristics. This is sometimes referred to as genetic entropy. The cost ultimately outweighs any short-term benefit. Mistakes have never been demonstrated to add functional information, but instead, they reduce it, seemingly the very essence of aging and death. Are we to believe that this type of entropy is reversible somehow by natural means, when all empirical observation refutes such an idea? This scientifically established principle is being largely ignored when he says,
mutations that arise in the homeobox, HOX, family of development regulating genes in animals can also have complex effects. HOX genes direct where legs, wing, antennae and body segments should grow. In fruit flies, for instance, the mutation called antennapedia causes legs to sprout where antennae should grow. These abnormal limbs are not functional, but their existence demonstrates that genetic mistakes can produce complex structures, which natural selection can then test for possible uses. Moreover, molecular biology has discovered mechanisms for genetic change that go beyond point mutations, and these expand the ways in which new traits can appear. Functional modules within genes can be spliced together in novel ways. Whole genes can be accidentally duplicated in an organism's DNA, and the duplicates are free to mutate into genes for new, complex features. Comparisons of the DNA from a wide variety of organisms indicate that this is how the globin family of blood proteins evolved over millions of years.
You can interpret such comparisons in a variety of ways, but the fact is, no such duplicates have ever been observed to mutate into genes with new, more complex features with increased function, therefore making it a statement of belief at best. Natural selection can certainly test these genetic mistakes for possible uses, but once again, the writer has cited examples of mutations caused by copying errors, that is to say, typographical errors in the replication of the genetic code, and also intelligent highly specified reorganization by scientists manipulating already existing genes under controlled conditions in the lab. The rest is, as far as anybody can see, speculative talk, and any claims of macro-evolving new genes over millions of years, is highly questionable, and so far, never observed. It would be groundbreaking, and the implications would certainly be disturbing and profound, for all of humanity, if any such thing was ever observed, and in non-scientific emotional religious terms, perhaps would have negative theological implications, and the daunting prospect of no future hope, beyond the current human lifespan. It would also defy logic, rationality, and information theory. Can mutations do all that this concept asserts? It has been theoretically calculated as being virtually impossible, and these predictions have been verified repeatedly. There have not been found any exceptions to this. So far no one has ever seen such a phenomenon, and many have looked.
11. Natural selection might explain microevolution, but it cannot explain the origin of new species and higher orders of life.
Yes, this is what the empirical evidence has shown. We have already been discussing the attempts to extrapolate microevolution up to macroevolution. Let's talk about it some more.
Evolutionary biologists have written extensively about how natural selection could produce new species. For instance, in the model called Illipatry, developed by Ernst Mayr of Harvard University, if a population of organisms were isolated from the rest of its species by geographical boundaries, it might be subjected to different selective pressures. Changes would accumulate in the isolated population. If those changes became so significant that the splinter group could not or routinely would not breed with the original stock, then the splinter group would be reproductively isolated and on its way toward becoming a new species.
But this is wishful thinking. Scientists generally recognize that isolating a population causes a genetic information bottleneck, which effectively is more likely to accelerate the degeneration of a population's genome, and this has been demonstrated many times. Since scientific people are skeptical, they require proper evidence. Could natural selection produce new species? It's an interesting question, but what is your definition of species? But so far, all that is mentioned is not evidence but a hypothetical model. Words like might be, and, if, don't say much for science. You have to ask the question as to whether in such isolated populations, the genetic information, in reality, would ever increase, or, as commonly observed, just remain duplicates, copying errors, or variations back and forth, and also, as has been proven with actual evidence, perceptively degrade over time, in certain situations.
Natural selection is the best studied of the evolutionary mechanisms, but biologists are open to other possibilities as well. Biologists are constantly assessing the potential of unusual genetic mechanisms for causing speciation or for producing complex features in organisms. Lynn Margulis of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and others, have persuasively argued that some cellular organelles, such as the energy-generating mitochondria, evolved through the symbiotic merger of ancient organisms. Thus, science welcomes the possibility of evolution resulting from forces beyond natural selection. Yet those forces must be natural. They cannot be attributed to the actions of mysterious creative intelligences, whose existence in scientific terms is unproved.
Atheists and evolutionists might keep speculatively hoping against such things perhaps, but where is the overwhelming evidence that he was talking about earlier? Natural selection is the best studied of the microevolutionary mechanisms but never observed to produce the imagined macroevolution process. The facts can be so inconvenient at times. But, they are what they are, whether evolutionists like them or not. As inventive as the stories are, once again it is important to emphasize that scientific evidence is needed. Observational science is what is required here. Hypothetical pondering is a starting point to an investigation, but is ultimately not enough. Real science requires reproducible empirical evidence before you can call something a fact, not just speculation. In order to separate facts from beliefs, scientifically we appeal to what science has repeatedly shown us, not to what it hasn't shown us. It has been repeatedly demonstrated that natural selection either recombines or eliminates genetic traits, but it has never been observed to create new, more complex, extra-functional, genetic code, and beyond these scientifically demonstrated empirical facts there is only indistinct imagination. Science has not thought up or discovered a proven mechanism that would allow biology to climb step by step up the back of Mount Improbable.
12. Nobody has ever seen a new species evolve.
Speciation is probably fairly rare and in many cases, might take centuries. Furthermore, recognizing a new species during a formative stage can be difficult. because biologists sometimes disagree about how best to define a species. The most widely used definition, Mayer's biological species concept, recognizes a species as a distinct community of reproductively isolated populations, sets of organisms that normally do not or cannot breed outside their community. In practice, this standard can be difficult to apply to organisms isolated by distance, or terrain, or to plants, and, of course, fossils do not breed. Biologists therefore usually use organisms' physical and behavioral traits as clues to their species membership. Nevertheless, the scientific literature does contain reports of apparent speciation events in plants, insects, and worms. In most of these experiments, researchers subjected organisms to various types of selection for anatomical differences, mating behaviors, habitat preferences, and other traits, and found that they had created populations of organisms that did not breed with outsiders. For example, William R. Rice of the University of New Mexico and George W. Salt of the University of California at Davis demonstrated that if they sorted a group of fruit flies by their preference for certain environments and bred those flies separately over 35 generations, the resulting flies would refuse to breed with those from a very different environment.
When we see what appears to be a new species, what are we really looking at? Once again, has anything genetically new been created at the molecular level, or has genetic information only been lost? Have we gained or lost? Or perhaps it might probably be attributable to the recombination of already existing genetic information, due to crossbreeding. Either way, this is all that we can claim has ever been proven, making it all rather uncontroversial. Unless there is some documented demonstration of increasing functional complexity coming from new novel functional genetic information that has not previously existed before, the macroevolution idea has nothing definitive to make it plausible. The mainstream definition of species can be a somewhat shaky one at times, and this is what is used sometimes to define macroevolution, but those particular examples of species that no longer interbreed are examples of downhill genetic evolution due to population bottlenecks. He says, speciation is probably fairly rare, which is a loaded statement. He wants to believe that such an imagined process of speciation has some chance of being probable, because of his a priori commitment to the Darwinian evolution ideology. Once again, speciation has a somewhat loose definition. There might be a very real possibility that genetically upward speciation, without intelligent design, might have absolutely zero probability, meaning it's impossible, so this depends on how a species is defined. The real question, when framed correctly, containing no assumptions and no ideological predispositions, is to ask whether speciation involving increased functional complexity is true or not. Scientists would fundamentally require experimentally testable evidence for them to decide. While these speculations may be fascinating, once again, you need to ask the entire question of whether new specified genetic information and new functional biological mechanisms can develop by only mindless natural processes. So far, it has never been empirically demonstrated. Also, the definition of what constitutes a species needs to be analyzed. Were those mutated fruit flies too damaged to survive in the natural world, and not just in the laboratory? Even so, they were still fruit flies, and nothing else. These mutations, these genetic errors, will they typically be corrected over successive generations, when crossbreeding with the other populations of non-mutants? Or more fundamentally, when testing for the macroevolution idea, can that particular strain that was taken from the original population ever increase its information over time, when kept in isolation from its former gene pool of biodiversity, or will it turn out to be a downhill process of genetic information loss and genetic function loss, like other observations thus far? Evolutionists typically hand-wave off the legitimate need for reproducible experimental evidence, with the argument that hundreds, thousands, or millions of years are needed to measure any macroevolutionary change, or upward speciation. But that does not fulfill scientific requirements, and instead makes it speculative at best. Because such ideas are untestable this way, perhaps those who make such claims are trying to boost their futile egos, because it feels safe to do so. Who can falsify it? What have such experiments shown so far? Nobody, up until now, has ever seen a new species upwardly evolve. But scientists like Behe, and Sanford, and others, who are skeptics of evolutionary theories, have pointed out, species have been observed tending to devolve, or degenerate over time, especially in smaller isolated populations. At best, we might see a subspeciation resulting from it all.
13. Evolutionists cannot point to any transitional fossils creatures that are half reptile and half bird, for instance.
Actually, paleontologists know of many detailed examples of fossils intermediate in form between various taxonomic groups. One of the most famous fossils of all time is Archaeopteryx, which combines feathers and skeletal structures peculiar to birds with features of dinosaurs. A flock's worth of other feathered fossil species, some more avian and some less, has also been found. A sequence of fossils spans the evolution of modern horses from the tiny Eohippus.
Since this article was written, these interpretations of Archaeopteryx and other things have been criticized by mainstream science. It seems that they have just cherry-picked various organisms from different areas in the fossils and lined them up to fit the idea according to similarities and differences, and this, therefore, seems like confirmation bias. The fact is, the fossils are not found in such neat order as some school books suggest. The Cambrian explosion and the punctuated equilibrium problem dramatically show this. So, the interpretation of such fossils is highly refutable. In scientific terms, the next loaded statements should be treated with a large degree of dubious disapproval for dogmatic language, because fanciful imagination leads evolutionists to make wild claims, such as the following.
Whales had four-legged ancestors that walked on land, and creatures known as Ambulocetus and Rhodhocetus helped to make that transition. See The Mammals That Conquered the Seas, by Kate Wong. Scientific American, May. Fossil seashells traced the evolution of various mollusks through millions of years. Perhaps 20 or more hominids, not all of them our ancestors, fill the gap between Lucy the Australopithecine and modern humans.
This purely philosophical language is not scientific, not backed up by repeatable experiments, and not any definitive historical evidence either. The uninitiated might wrongly get the impression here that these hypothetical beliefs are correct, but this guesswork is heavily disputed by scientists from all walks of life. Intelligent design advocates also retort that such interpretations of fossils are wrong and anecdotal, and viewed through a Darwinian lens, and perhaps more pointedly, through an atheistic lens. The engineering problems of any land animal, evolving unplanned into something like a whale, that can live in the oceanic environment, seems ludicrously impossible. There is no testable, falsifiable hypothesis, or evidence, to show this idea to be more than just imaginary. They invoke the untestable ad hoc hypothesis, of claiming such to take millions of years, to further rescue their belief from falsification. The article continues.
Creationists, though, dismiss these fossil studies. They argue that Archaeopteryx is not a missing link between reptiles and birds, it is just an extinct bird with reptilian features. They want evolutionists to produce a weird, chimeric monster that cannot be classified as belonging to any known group. Even if a creationist does accept a fossil as transitional between two species, he or she may then insist on seeing other fossils intermediate between it and the first two. These frustrating requests can proceed ad infinitum and place an unreasonable burden on the always incomplete fossil record.
Putting aside this straw man argument involving a chimeric monster, one very obvious problem, that even evolutionists recognize, intermediate, fossilized stages are a prediction of the Darwinian hypothesis that have largely failed to be realized. From the scientific perspective, is it not reasonable to expect the supposed transitional stages to be found in fossils, if they ever existed at all? Why do we only see punctuated discrete forms, many of which still exist today, without any smooth distribution of graduated intermediates? Should not the burden of proof be on the evolutionists to show that such required missing links ever existed in the first place? This only goes to demonstrate how open the question needs to be when interpreting fossil-based evidence. Does the idea of special creation seem to fit this evidence better? Is it appropriate to force exclusionary naturalistic explanations on such? An open-minded investigator cannot rule out the possibility that maybe those posited intermediate stages never existed, and this might show that the fossil record, in this regard, is not as incomplete as evolutionists like to believe, no matter what explanation anyone would like to imagine for such punctuated equilibrium and the Cambrian explosion. Who knows? Missing links are part of the evolutionists' speculations, and must be treated with skepticism by science, until they are proven to exist. The evidence might not always show what we want it to show, but we must follow the evidence wherever it leads.
Nevertheless, evolutionists can cite further supportive evidence from molecular biology. All organisms share most of the same genes, but as evolution predicts, the structures of these genes and their products diverge among species, in keeping with their evolutionary relationships.
But what is the evidence actually supporting this argument by exclusion here is obvious. Evolutionary relationships is another dogmatic and loaded expression of the evolutionists' vade-mecum for macroevolutionary hypotheses, but that in itself doesn't necessarily make it right or wrong. Once again, this is the typical argument from similarities, and the intelligent design perspective has been arbitrarily excluded from being part of the question. Intelligent design theory, if included in the ensemble of guesswork, would also predict the same for the structures of genes and their products, according to common design principles, but this has been deliberately ignored and omitted. The flawed reasoning can be demonstrated by way of analogy. Different computer programs also have similarities in their code, but they were all intelligently programmed. In biology, genetic evidence alone cannot distinguish between the idea of common design principles and the idea of common ancestry. Something else empirical is needed to point us in a proven direction. Here is another dogmatic statement. He says,
geneticists speak of the molecular clock that records the passage of time. These molecular data also show how various organisms are transitional within evolution.
Can we prove how molecular data shows how various organisms are transitional, or is it just wishful thinking? It may be hard to say. No one has proven how it happened. The evidence is inconclusive, and to say that it records the passage of time is sheer guesswork. To prognosticate that genes prove macroevolutionary transitions, upward change, occurred, is credulous. Molecular clocks have been calibrated by having speculated deep time taken for granted, and other imagined processes assumed into them, which therefore determines the answer that they give. It all rests on a set of unproven speculated past events. Until molecular clocks can be calibrated according to something well-founded, the results they give are somewhat meaningless. Whether or not to put faith in such is a tricky problem, at best. One must remain skeptical but open-minded.
14. Living things have fantastically intricate features at the anatomical, cellular and molecular levels that could not function if they were any less complex or sophisticated. The only prudent conclusion is that they are the products of intelligent design, not evolution.
We have had explained to us very well, but perhaps inadvertently, the principle of irreducible complexity, and one argument that comes from it.
This argument from design is the backbone of most recent attacks on evolution, but it is also one of the oldest. In 1802, theologian William Paley wrote that if one finds a pocket watch in a field, the most reasonable conclusion is that someone dropped it, not that natural forces created it there. By analogy, Paley argued, the complex structures of living things must be the handiwork of direct, divine invention. Darwin wrote, On the origin of species as an answer to Paley, he explained how natural forces of selection, acting on inherited features, could gradually shape the evolution of ornate organic structures. Generations of creationists have tried to counter Darwin by citing the example of the eye as a structure that could not have evolved. The eye's ability to provide vision depends on the perfect arrangement of its parts. These critics say, natural selection could thus never favor the transitional forms needed during the eye's evolution. What good is half an eye? Anticipating this criticism, Darwin suggested that even incomplete eyes might confer benefits, such as helping creatures orient toward light, and thereby survive for further evolutionary refinement. Biology has vindicated Darwin. Researchers have identified primitive eyes and light-sensing organs throughout the animal kingdom, and have even tracked the evolutionary history of eyes through comparative genetics. It now appears that in various families of organisms, eyes have evolved independently.
Interesting arguments are coming from both sides. In a very narrow sense, biology has vindicated Darwin about his guess that simpler types of eyes might exist. It is important to keep in mind, no one has ever observed an organism transitioning into a more complex organism, and therefore neither simpler eyes into more complex eyes either. Once again, common design principles can also just as well be a concurring explanation. Eyes on some organisms are relatively simple. One has to say, relatively, because there is nothing simple about comparatively less complex eyes in different types of organisms. They are all very complex in their own way. Evolutionists who say that scientists have tracked the evolutionary history of eyes through comparative genetics are providing us with a clear example of their prior commitment to the Darwinian belief, and have cherry-picked examples to fit their hypothetical model. The built-in assumptions are that the imagined evolutionary history can be tracked using comparative genetics, but what, in reality, are we actually tracking? What excludes the possibility of the similarity of the different genetic codes being written by an intelligent programmer? Is such exclusion from evidence or ideology? The data has been organized to exclusively fit the evolutionary idea, instead of letting the evidence impartially lead to either a conclusion, or for it to remain an open question. One thing we can say correctly is that, so far, new more complex functional code has never been observed evolving into existence. It is interesting that evolutionists now believe, it appears to them in various families of organisms, eyes have evolved independently. They are inadvertently admitting the absence of common lineage, at least with the eyes. A creationist might say that the way of evidence is such that it appears more likely that these organisms are separate creations, and it would appear that they have all been intelligently designed, with eyes of one kind or another, for different situations, fit for purpose.
Today's intelligent design advocates are more sophisticated than their predecessors, but their arguments and goals are not fundamentally different. They criticize evolution by trying to demonstrate that it could not account for life as we know it, and then insist that the only tenable alternative is that life was designed by an unidentified intelligence.
Darwinists are more sophisticated these days than those in the past, who advocated spontaneous generation. Such people used to believe that maggots spontaneously emerged from rotten meat, until Louis Pasteur experimentally disproved it. These days, Darwinists advocate the unsubstantiated idea that life can spontaneously emerge from non-life, and also they advocate their belief that more functionally complex genetic code can emerge from less complexity. These more modern ideas, like their past counterparts, have been demonstrated as being myths, via experiment and observation. Why some people still choose to believe those ideas, despite the entropy principle and all other various experimental evidence to the contrary, is a psychological question, and maybe less of a scientific one. Intelligent design advocates now claim that it has been shown scientifically that all known evolutionary mechanisms suggested cannot account for the origin of life forms, and instead of these mechanisms being creative, they have been demonstrated, in many cases, to be degenerative, that is to say, ultimately destructive. For whatever reason, some find the idea of intelligent design uncomfortable while others find it interesting. And ID advocates are proud of it too, in letting empirical observation guide their conclusions. That is where ID advocates stop. On the other hand, biblical creationists do identify who they believe to be the creative intelligent designer as Jehovah, or Yahweh, which are two modern pronunciations for the name of God, originally found in the ancient biblical manuscripts, and more recent archaeological evidence of ancient manuscripts suggests that it may have originally been pronounced Jehovah. Originally discovered by archaeologists are ancient texts, including biblical text, written on very old papyrus scrolls, revealing numerous times the four Hebrew consonants typically referred to as the tetragrammaton. So, in this case, the believed creator is identified. But admittedly that's a faith-based argument. And that is what science cannot do. It can't always name the designer, although it would seem we have a very good suspect. Scientists can develop methods to identify the hallmarks of design and/or intelligent causation. People have been sent to prison based on far weaker evidence. Forensic science and archaeology do this kind of thing all the time. Even if you are skeptical of religious dogma, and view scripture to be of human origin only, nonetheless, numerous ancient copies of scripture have been found, some dating back to very early times, cross-checked and verified, and there is little doubt that the original meaning of it has been well preserved for us today, and this achievement is from one of the most exhaustive and longest-running scientifically rigorous restoration processes of all time. Even if you simply view it as an ancient historical artifact, there is no credible basis for denying the accurate quality of its preservation.
15. Recent discoveries prove that even at the microscopic level, life has a quality of complexity that could not have come about through evolution.
Irreducible complexity is the battle cry of Michael J. Behe, of Lehigh University, author of Darwin's Black Box, The Biochemical Challenge to Evolution. As a household example of irreducible complexity, Behe chooses the mousetrap, a machine that could not function if any of its pieces were missing, and whose pieces have no value except as parts of the whole. What is true of the mousetrap, he says, is even truer of the bacterial flagellum, a whip-like cellular organelle, used for propulsion, that operates like an outboard motor. The proteins that make up a flagellum are uncannily arranged into motor components, a universal joint and other structures like those that a human engineer might specify. The possibility that this intricate array could have arisen through evolutionary modification is virtually nil, Behe argues, and that bespeaks intelligent design. He makes similar points about the blood's clotting mechanism and other molecular systems. Yet evolutionary biologists have answers to these objections. First, there exist flagellae with forms simpler than the one that Behe cites, so it is not necessary for all those components to be present for a flagellum to work. The sophisticated components of this flagellum all have precedence elsewhere in nature, as described by Kenneth R. Miller of Brown University and others. In fact, the entire flagellum assembly is extremely similar to an organelle that Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague bacterium, uses to inject toxins into cells. The key is that the flagellum's component structures, which Behe suggests have no value apart from their role in propulsion, can serve multiple functions that would have helped favor their evolution. The final evolution of the flagellum might then have involved only the novel recombination of sophisticated parts that initially evolved for other purposes.
The speculation is reasonable. However, it is the novel recombination of sophisticated parts where one real problem lies for Darwinian belief. The Dover trial sadly failed to make widely known the true explanation of irreducible complexity. People like Kenneth R. Miller of Brown University and others have mischaracterized the irreducible complexity argument. Michael Behe speculated that the flagellum's individual component structures have no value in other biological systems. Even if in some cases this turns out to be wrong, this was not the critical part of his argument. Much of this has yet to be fully looked at. The most critical part of his argument from a design perspective is, he was merely highlighting the outrageous improbability that these separate components or parts, whether functional or non-functional, could ever come together by themselves, only due to blind unplanned natural processes, in terms of gradual successive steps, without any intelligent intervention, to form this outboard motor-like biological machine, and then give nature something to select. The flagellum's propulsion system appears to be an all-or-nothing mechanism. It is a reasonable argument that this entire propulsion system can only function when all those parts are in place. Otherwise, it would be energy-wasting junk on the organism and nature would likely have selected it for extinction. That is not to say that in some biological systems there might not be a certain amount of redundancy designed into the system, the parts of which could be removed and still allow the system to function on some level. But there are empirically established critical non-redundant parts that certain evolutionists are choosing to ignore, but rather focus on the perhaps redundant parts to support their narratives. Just because some things in other organisms are extremely similar, does not necessarily make them the same, and neither is that in itself a proof for them being suitable as part of a different organism's irreducible mechanism, especially if, in the case of the flagellum motor, only 10 out of a required 40 proteins are the same, since you have not accounted for the other 30, and therefore have by no means ruled out common design principles being used on different things. Once again the logical error is manifest where the argument from similarity has been invoked to support evolution but, in a biased manner, excluding it as support for possible common design principles when citing 10 common proteins used by both systems. The real difficulty that is hand-waved away is going from 10 to the required 40. How is it possible for those extra 30 proteins to combine in a precise manner to provide a very specific all-or-nothing function? And keep in mind, we are not describing one of each protein molecule but many of each, and these molecules do not self-replicate. The evolutionist has a large burden of proof to bear here, seemingly impossible, but they are certainly entitled to question the validity of the all-or-nothing aspect within the argument and perhaps come up with evidence to the contrary.
Similarly, the blood clotting system seems to involve the modification and elaboration of proteins that were originally used in digestion, according to studies by Russell F. Doolittle of the University of California at San Diego. So, some of the complexity that he calls proof of intelligent design is not irreducible at all.
More speculation. There has not been a complete logical naturalistic pathway demonstrated here at all. Can we dismiss the notion of common design principles here too? Does only some of the complexity seem reducible? Is that enough information to make the logical leap in saying that it is not irreducible at all? Even that is debatable and hardly a reason to reject the entire argument. One cannot with absolute certainty say that all of the blood clotting mechanism is not irreducible at all. Perhaps a more obvious example of this is, even a human can lose an arm or a leg and still go on living, but take away a vital organ and it is quite a different story. It may be in a similar way, most of the blood clotting system appears to be irreducible, which leaves a great deal of the complexity to be explained, and therefore the argument for evolution would still have great hurdles, perhaps impossible hurdles, to overcome. So, why the seeming eagerness to skip over and ignore this elephant in the room? His argument still holds up. The whole thing might still be irreducible. Let's continue.
Complexity of a different kind, specified complexity, is the cornerstone of the intelligent design arguments of William A. Dembski of Baylor University, in his books, The Design Inference and No Free Lunch. Essentially his argument is that living things are complex in a way that, undirected, random processes, could never produce. The only logical conclusion, Dembski asserts, in an echo of Paley 200 years ago, is that some superhuman intelligence created and shaped life. Dembski's argument contains several holes. It is wrong to insinuate that the field of explanations consists only of random processes or designing intelligences. Researchers into nonlinear systems and cellular automata at the Santa Fe Institute and elsewhere have demonstrated that simple, undirected processes can yield extraordinarily complex patterns. Some of the complexity seen in organisms may therefore emerge through natural phenomena that we as yet barely understand. But that is far different from saying that the complexity could not have arisen naturally.
What complex patterns does he refer to? Nothing functional or purposeful? Dembski is entitled to insinuate or posit what he likes. The levels of complexity he talks about still support his insinuations and have not been refuted at all. To ignore these arguments would be irrational, so once again the serious scientists will wait for convincing conclusive empirical evidence before they are shifted from their required skeptical positions.
Creation science is a contradiction, in terms. A central tenet of modern science is methodological naturalism. It seeks to explain the universe purely in terms of observed or testable natural mechanisms. Thus, physics describes the atomic nucleus with specific concepts governing matter and energy, and it tests those descriptions experimentally. Physicists introduce new particles, such as quarks, to flesh out their theories only when data show that the previous descriptions cannot adequately explain observed phenomena. The new particles do not have arbitrary properties. Moreover, their definitions are tightly constrained, because the new particles must fit within the existing framework of physics. In contrast, intelligent design theorists invoke shadowy entities that conveniently have whatever unconstrained abilities are needed to solve the mystery at hand. Rather than expanding scientific inquiry, such answers shut it down. How does one disprove the existence of omnipotent intelligences?
That is only fair if scientists don't hypocritically ridicule other belief systems. Let's be fair and turn that argument around. How does one disprove the concept of abiogenesis or macroevolution? To be consistent, rational, and impartial, by the same way of logic, we would also have to argue that Darwinian evolutionary science is a contradiction in terms. Such macroevolutionary theorists also invoke shadowy entities that conveniently have whatever unconstrained abilities that are needed in many an ad hoc hypothetical attempt to abridge the gap of ignorance in their unsubstantiated just-so story. Despite the experimentally testable entropy law, they still choose to believe the abiogenesis and macroevolution dogmas. Rather than expanding scientific inquiry, such exclusionary dismissal of design possibilities can shut down important criticisms and overlook critical questions, which in turn delay discoveries. The unnecessarily delayed discoveries of soft tissue in dinosaur bones is a prominent example, and also the falsified Darwinian assumptions of junk DNA. Or for that matter, to consider how mutation and natural selection have not been experimentally demonstrated to have the amount of creative power imagined for them. Or how many of the organs once wrongly assumed to be vestigial are now known to have a purposeful function. Or how natural processes have only been demonstrated to be repetitive, reiterative, or degenerative but never demonstrated to produce increased functional complexity. The design perspective often leads scientists in the right direction with their problem solving. Also, once again, the writer is inappropriately making comparisons of two entirely different disciplines. Comparing the macroevolution belief to proven physics is misleading and inappropriate. If one could prove, by some reproducible experiment, a natural process that overcomes entropic improbabilities to create life or increase functional complexity, they would have a stronger case, but this has never happened. Many scientists believe in God and still constrain themselves in the use of methodological naturalism. It is a bogus argument to suggest that intelligent design shuts down the inquiry. The writer claims
intelligent design offers few answers. For instance, when and how did a designing intelligence intervene in life's history? By creating the first DNA? The first cell? The first human? Was every species designed, or just a few early ones? Proponents of intelligent design theory frequently decline to be pinned down on these points. They do not even make real attempts to reconcile their disparate ideas about intelligent design. Instead, they pursue argument by exclusion, that is, they belittle evolutionary explanations as far-fetched, or incomplete, and then imply that only design-based alternatives remain.
Proponents of intelligent design don't always dispute microevolutionary facts, but mostly perhaps, as the writer puts it, belittle the speculative idea of macroevolution and abiogenesis, partly due to the well-established entropy principle. The writer did ask some good questions about when and how did a designing intelligence intervene in life's history, but does he have enough open-mindedness toward some possible responses? It would seem not. But then again, who knows? And yet, it has been suggested that the intelligent design perspective has offered many answers where other approaches have failed. Qualified scientists, some of who are also intelligent design advocates, refuse to be pinned down on anything that science cannot prove, like the unsubstantiated just-so stories of evolutionists. Is intelligent design an argument by exclusion, or are the scientists who agree with the intelligent design concept taking the Darwinian arguments seriously and closely examining the Darwinian theory at the most fundamental level possible to conclude that Darwinian evolution is a flawed, poorly supported fantasy? If one cannot scientifically prove who the designer is despite their belief, but only the evidence for intelligent causation, or natural causation, then this would be the properly constrained scientifically rigorous method of separating facts from beliefs. Methodological naturalism can sometimes also be turned into an argument by exclusion when one excludes intelligent design as being one of the possible explanations of the phenomenon and dismisses the evidence, even sometimes the phenomena that have been laid out for it. In such cases, it ignores the legitimately required principle of total evidence, as you would expect with forensic science and archaeological science. The hand-waving dismissals, by Darwinists and atheists, of irreducibly complex phenomena in biological systems, is astounding, and willfully ignorant. Evolutionists can speculate all they want about how such phenomena might have come to be there, but they cannot dismiss the scientifically established irreducible functionality found in biological systems. But they are entitled to such gap-filling guesses. And their convoluted excuses to get around the entropy principle are quite entertaining. As far as unconstrained belief systems go, this one is very prominent. Such belittling of how the macroevolution idea violates the entropy principle seems rational considering all experiences of the world that are known. Scientific arguments are supposed to be based on repeatable evidence and not faith. It is argued that the idea of upward evolution is belittled by skeptics because it is largely based on not just reasonable faith, but more blind faith, and lacks the needed evidence, and yet claims to be scientific when in reality it is mostly a philosophical precept which is forced upon the evidence a priori. It seems reasonable to ask the question, should evidence for intelligent design be excluded? Intelligent design might end up proving to be the only viable explanation. Why not keep an open mind? But he insists.
Logically, this is misleading. Even if one naturalistic explanation is flawed, it does not mean that all are. Moreover, it does not make one intelligent design theory more reasonable than another. Listeners are essentially left to fill in the blanks for themselves, and some will undoubtedly do so by substituting their religious beliefs for scientific ideas.
Another person might think that this philosophy is not logical. Who is to say whether one intelligent design theory is more reasonable than another? Ideas, scientific or otherwise, ultimately require conclusive evidence. Even if one intelligent design argument is flawed, it does not mean that they all are. Science relies often on an inference to the best explanation that fits all known facts. To be completely unbiased, it is reasonable to point out the possibility of never having a completely sufficient naturalistic explanation for the origin of life or the origin of species. It might be possible to determine which explanation is more flawed using current scientific methods, and it seems entirely rational. Renowned ex-atheist Antony Flew said that we must follow the evidence wherever it leads. At the age of 81, he renounced atheism, because he conceded that better scientific understanding, at the foundation of life, had made the design argument far more powerful. This kind of humility is refreshing.
Time and again, science has shown that methodological naturalism can push back ignorance, finding increasingly detailed and informative answers to mysteries that once seemed impenetrable: the nature of light, the causes of disease, how the brain works.
So far that is sound reasoning, but then he puts forth a conflated argument when he says,
evolution is doing the same with the riddle of how the living world took shape. Creationism, by any name, adds nothing of intellectual value to the effort.
www.scientificamerican.com. That of course is his opinion, but other people would disagree on the consensual evolutionary story of how the world took shape and say that certain types of creationism add more intellectual value to science and say that certain ideas contained within Darwinian theory add nothing of intellectual value to science. Some high-minded evolutionists look down on Darwinian skeptics with disdain, but is such scorn justified? How much of the biological mysteries is the Darwinian evolution theory helpful in solving? Many scientists feel that the unsubstantiated parts of Darwinism add nothing to scientific efforts, but if anything they have slowed down progress. Among scientists, there are varying viewpoints on the subject. Biologists, without even consciously acknowledging it, often generally investigate biology from a design perspective. It was said at the outset of this chapter, some types of evolution are proven fact. Methodological naturalism has certainly pushed back much ignorance, but the Darwinian evolution tenets, macroevolution and abiogenesis, have not done the same. Acceptance of Darwinian evolution as being the ultimate creator currently seems to rely on much faith and even credulity. Certainly not much on direct unambiguous observations and repeatable experiments. Many confuse methodological naturalism with Darwinism, but actually, they are two separate methodologies. One is reliable, the other is a philosophical precept. Rennie asserted his opinion at that time saying, "Creationism, by any name, adds nothing of intellectual value to the effort, but for this idea to be consistent then one could say with similar conviction that evolutionism, by any name, adds nothing of intellectual value to the effort of science and is a philosophy and imagination that is forced upon the evidence." So, the writer, like so many, seems to be inferring that intelligent design is just creationism in disguise by another name. Perhaps he might be right on this point. In another article written for Scientific American by John Rennie and Steve Mirsky, April 16, 2008, entitled, "6 Things in Expelled That Ben Stein Doesn't Want You to Know," when referring to the movie Expelled, their article rightfully criticizes parts of the ID movement for politicizing the debate between intelligent design advocates and Darwinists, how the documentary film itself selectively quoted Darwin, how certain scenes were contrived or how certain people were interviewed under a false pretext. But this straw-man politics detract people from the more important fundamental issue about scientific truth and pseudoscience, about the demarcation issue between scientific facts and unproven guesses, such as the well-known distinction between microevolution and macroevolution. He argues that evolution is compatible with belief in God and points out that many do believe in both. Nonetheless, the writing is still dogmatic about it when talking about how people know that evolution is true without specifying which facet of Darwin's theory is being represented, thereby possibly conflating facts with evolutionism's unsubstantiated just-so stories, of abiogenesis and macroevolution, in the minds of the unwary. But people will believe what they want to anyway. In reference to the article, it must be acknowledged, it is reasonable to suggest that Darwin did not intend for his theory to have harmful consequences on humanity and societies, even though it manifestly has had that unintentional effect sometimes. But it wouldn't be the first time nor the last where good intentions have turned out bad. Should we acknowledge all the different viewpoints around us in society? Will that help us move forward? Some more religious biblical creationists have posited other psychological reasons why many prefer to believe the ideas contained within Darwinian evolution. They say that the just so stories about abiogenesis and macroevolution provide justification in the minds of people who are living a sinful lifestyle, who don't want to believe in the existence of God, because they don't like the idea that they might be accountable to God for the bad things they have been doing, and also they don't want to stop enjoying their bad way of life. So in effect, the abiogenesis and macroevolution doctrines are beliefs that have become a kind of practicing religion where sin is not a valid word anymore. It is said that according to biblical teaching, God is forgiving toward repentant people but not so much toward unrepentant ones. Such a thing requires humility and strength of character, and it is said that some do not have such and therefore are not humble enough to change their ways. The definitions of good and bad are argued over continually nowadays. But, in principle, it would be inferred that willful ignorance is ultimately no hiding place from the law when on trial. Others strongly object to this line of thought because they are good people who would argue that it is merely out of skepticism and mistrust toward religion that keeps them from making such a leap of faith. Others assert that there is much peer pressure to conform to the secular views, and so people of weak character will buckle under the force of all those influences and not have rationality and logic guide their thinking and actions, and therefore let others tell them what to think, and how to think. But that objection can cut both ways in both secular and the more traditional religious institutions. But never mind the ideological commitments, religious beliefs, or the profound philosophical implications. Let's just be concerned about the scientific arguments, the facts, and the evidence that is available to us, for now. The writer started with some very strong assertions, but when analyzing his arguments to support them, the evidence was incredibly weak and disappointing. His incomplete explanation of the second law of thermodynamics would have left the average reader none the wiser if we didn't look at it more closely. Much of that article rested on ideology, consensus, and belief in unproven hypotheses, and any facts that were mentioned could only be used as anecdotes. Even he had to admit that there is no direct observation of speciation. One might imagine that the normal reader may have been hoping for a lot more,